exporter at the importer's request to effect payment up to a stated amount within a stated time. And the payment is effected against presentation of specified documents that must comply. Remember, compliance of documents is very important with the terms and conditions of the credit. And banks deal in documents, not in goods. And these transactions are governed by UCP, Uniform Customs and Practice for Documentary Credit, ICC publication number 600. Scpecialized?
Birinchi slaydimizda ko'rib turibsizlar, bu akkreditiv nimaligini ma'nosi aytib o'tilgan. Bunda o'sha LC deb ham aytiladi, ya'ni letter of credit ham deb aytiladi. Bunda aytilyaptiki, hujjatli kredit bu bank tomonidan yozma majburiyat importyorning talabiga binoan eksport qiluvchiga beriladi. Bu o'sha belgilangan muddatga, belgilangan miqdordagi to'lovni amalga oshirish uchun beriladi va bunda bank kerakli hujjatlarni qabul qilgandan keyin to'lovlarni amalga oshiradi. Kredit shartlariga asosan, o'sha berilgan kredit shartlariga asosan bank hujjatlarni o'zi qabul qilib olgandan keyin to'lovlarni amalga oshiradi.
Thank you. And just again, a reminder of the flow with the documentary credit. Once the payment method is agreed, the importer has to go to his bank, request an LC to be issued. Of course, that bank will need a facility before they can go ahead and issue the LC. Once they have a credit line in place and they're satisfied with the LC, they can go ahead and issue it, usually via SWIFT, MT700 message. It goes across to the advising bank. On the export side, that bank then authenticates and advises the LC to the beneficiary. That's the first half of the cycle. And then the second half of the cycle, goods get shipped, exporter presents documents in to the export bank, which can be known as the presenting or negotiating bank. They check the documents. If they're fully compliant, they will offer to pay the beneficiary, the exporter, negotiate the documents. They will go ahead and pay and charge interest up until the time they receive reimbursement from the issuing bank. So the documents then get passed back to the issuing bank. The issuing bank also checks the documents at step 8. Payment is not made at step 9 back to the presenting bank. And then 10 and 11 is an exchange of documents and cash between the issuing bank and the importer. And that concludes the standard LC cycle. Scpecialized?
Akkreditatsiyalar qanday ishlaydi? O'shani siklini mana bu prezentatsiyada ko'rishlaring mumkin. Bemalol, ya'ni birinchi eksportyor bilan importyor o'rtasida savdo shartnomasi imzolanadi. Undan keyingi ikkinchi qadam o'sha akkreditivga zaявление topshiriladi. Importyor o'zini bankiga, undan keyingi etap bizda mana uchinchisida ko'rib turibsizlar, o'sha issuing bank, ya'ni importyor bank akkreditiv chiqaradi va advising bank, ya'ni eksportyorni bankiga uni topshiradi. Undan keyingi qismi eksportyor banki bir-biri har xil переговорlarni olib boradi, обсужденияларni olib boradi va undan keyingi etapi ko'rib turibsizlar, o'sha berilgan dokumentlar, berilgan o'sha akkreditiv nimalarga talablarga javob bergandan keyin mahsulotlar eksportyor tomonidan importyorga yetkazib beriladi. Undan keyingi etap, 6-etap, eksportyor o'zining dokumentlarini, o'sha hujjatlarni eksportyor o'zining bankiga topshiradi va undan keyin eksportyor banki bu hujjatlarni hammasini ko'rib chiqadi, nazoratdan o'tkazadi va o'sha akkreditivlarni shartlariga javob bergan holda javob bersa, bu hujjatlar keyin nima eksportyor agar pul mablag'ini birdaniga olishni xohlasa, birdaniga o'sha eksportyor o'ziga benefitsiarga, ya'ni pulni o'tkazib beradi. Faqatgina o'sha muddatdagi protsentkani to'lash sharti bilan va undan keyin 8-etap bizda ko'rib turibsizlar, eksportyor bank importyor bankiga hujjatlarni beradi, importyor bank hujjatlarni tekshirib o'tadi va undan keyin importyor bank agar hujjatlar hammasi javob bersa, talablarga pulni o'tkazib beradi eksportyor bankiga va bu keyin importyordan hujjatlar talab qilinadi. Importyor hujjatlarni importyor o'zini bankiga beradi va o'sha pul mablag'ini o'zini bankiga o'tkazib beradi. Bu o'sha operativ qanaqangi ishlash sikli. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So just check, are there any questions at this point? Is that okay for everybody? This is the standard LC flow. Any questions at all?
Agar qanaqadir savollar bo'lsa, hozir shu paytgacha bemalol savollarni berishlari mumkin.
No questions, Roger.
Okay. All right, please put your questions in chat if you have any questions, and Amrutha will pick them up. Okay, and then just also a reminder of why LCs are the best payment method. They can be used in many different situations, as you're going to see now when we go through the various specialized types of LC. They can help improve the cash flow for the customer, especially if usance LCs are used. Remember, usance LCs are term LCs, so they have a credit period. Could be up to 180 days or even 360 days. When borrowing against an LC, you're borrowing against the currency of the LC, which is usually a hard currency such as US dollars or euros or yen, and interest rates are very low. So there's usually a big interest arbitrage or benefit if you borrow against the LC rather than financing your imports locally in local currency. So there's definitely lower borrowing costs, lower interest rates. It reduces risks, especially fraud, because documents have to be presented and checked before payment is made. So it's a more secure payment method than open account or than payment in advance. And payment is only made once documents are checked and found to be fully compliant. Documents are checked by bankers. And in using this payment method, both importers and exporters can have the opportunity to open up new markets, new suppliers in new markets, new buyers in new markets, because it's a secure payment method. So it's good for the bank and it's good for the customer. So that's just a summary of why LCs are the best payment method. I'll just let you quickly go over that, checkbox, and then we'll get into the individual special types of LC.
Okay. Prezentatsiyamizni, ya'ni har akkreditivlarning turlarini o'rganishdan oldin nima uchun akkreditivlar eng yaxshi to'lov turi hisoblanishini aytib o'tamiz. Bunda birinchida o'sha bundan birlaridan bittasidan biri bu har xil situatsiyalarda ishlatilishi mumkin akkreditivlar va har xil situatsiyalarga moslashishi mumkin. Undan tashqari pul oqimini pul boshqaruv oqimini juda ham keyingi rivojlantirish mumkin. Akkreditivlar ishlatish orqali asosan o'sha usance akkreditiv shartlariga binoan va bundan tashqari o'sha qarz olish, ya'ni kredit olish narxlari juda ham past bo'ladi. Agar albatta o'sha valyuta xorijiy valyutada moliyalashtirish bo'layotgan bo'lsa, undan tashqari riskni anchagina kamayadi va undan tashqari firibgarlikni oldini oladi akkreditivlar ishlatilgan paytida. Va bundan tashqari to'lov bajariladi qachonki hamma hujjatlar to'liq bo'lgan paytda, ya'ni agarda eksportyor yoki importyor hujjatlarida qanaqadir kamchiliklar bo'ladigan bo'lsa, unda to'lov amalga oshirilmaydi. Bundan tashqari hujjatlar bankirlar tomonidan tekshirib o'tiladi, ya'ni eksportyor va importyor banklar albatta hujjatlarni nazoratdan o'tkazadi. Va undan tashqari benefitsarga ham importyorga ham yangi bozorlar, yangi imkoniyatlarni ochish uchun juda ham yaxshi imkoniyat beradi akkreditivlar, chunki akkreditivlar juda ham xavfsiz to'lov turi hisoblanadi. Shuning uchun importyor va eksportyor bemalol qo'rqmasdan akkreditivlardan foydalanishi mumkin. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So these are the special types of LC we're going to look at today. Standby LCs, some of their common uses, guarantee facilities, bid or performance bonds, support open account trading, red clause LCs, revolving LCs, transferable LC, and back-to-back LC. So we start with standby LC. Now the standby LC is a guarantee issued in the form of an LC, and it covers non-performance. So unlike the other LCs, you do not expect a standby LC to be drawn. It is only drawn in the event of default, when something has gone wrong. Shakboz, I'll let you summarize that.
Bugun o'sha akkreditivlarning turlari haqida gaplashamiz. Bunda standby LC, ya'ni standby akkreditiv, red clause akkreditivlar, revolverованный akkreditivlar, transferable и back-to-back akkreditivlar haqida gaplashamiz. Birinchisi bu standby akkreditiv turi hisoblanadi. Bu odatda ishlatıladi o'sha garantирование talablariga binoan yoki har xil bondlar ishlab chiqarishga qimmatli qog'ozlar va undan tashqari bu ko'proq поддерживать qiladi o'sha ochiq hisob savdoni ko'proq поддерживать qiladi standby LC. Yes, Roger.
So one example of the use of a standby LC is to support open account trade. Remember when we looked at open account trade, the exporter is taking quite a lot of risk because he's shipping his goods and he's hoping that payment will be made in the future. But there's no guarantee that the payment will be made in the future. So one potential solution to that is for the exporter to request a standby LC in his favor. And this is what it would look like. The exporter agrees on open account terms, but a condition of the open account terms are that the importer issue a standby LC, or the importer's bank issue a standby LC in favor of the exporter. So step one is the contract. Step two would be the standby LC application from the importer to his bank. Of course, once again, his bank will need to have a facility in order to be able to issue a standby LC for the importer, the applicant. If they're happy to do so, if they have a credit facility, they go ahead and issue the standby LC. Typically, it would have a validity of 6 or 12 months for the expiry date. So the standby LC gets issued. Step 3, it is authenticated by the advising bank. Step 4, and advised to the exporter. Now, once the exporter has a standby LC, effectively that's a guarantee that covers him in the event the importer does not pay for the goods that he is going to ship. So he can go ahead now and make multiple shipments over the next 6 months, 12 months, depending on the LC expiry. And if everything goes smoothly, there will be no drawing under this LC. It's only in the event that the importer defaults and does not pay for the goods that are being shipped that there would be a drawing under the LC, and that is the step 7 and step 8, the payment from the bank, the exporter's bank, and then step 9 and step 10, reimbursement on the issuing bank, and then finally settlement between the issuing bank and the importer. So step 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and 12 should not happen. They only happen in the event of default. What you would normally expect here is just for the LC to be advised and to sit in the background for the next 6 or 12 months. Shakboz?
Standby akkreditivlarni asosiy ishlatishdan bu maqsad bu bundan oldingi o'tgan seminarda aytib o'tilganday biz to'lovni amalga oshirishimiz mumkin oddiygina hisob ochish orqali va esinglarda bo'lsa agar hisob ochish orqali to'lovni amalga oshirilgan paytida birinchi eksportyor mahsulotlarni importyorga yetkazib berardi va undan keyin to'lovni qabul qilib olardi va eksportyor juda ham katta riskni o'z zimmasiga olardi. Bu yerda agarda eksportyor bu riskni anchagina kamaytirish uchun importyordan so'rash, importyorga aytish kerak. То, что standby LC, ya'ni standby akkreditivni ochish uchun agar o'sha standby akkreditivni ishlatgan paytida importyor anchagina eksportyor anchagina riskni kamaytiradi va bemalol ishlashi mumkin va bunda qanaqa bo'lishi mumkin? Birinchi etapda ko'rib turibsizlar, importyor bilan eksportyor o'rtasida shartnoma bo'ladi, kontrakt, ya'ni undan keyin importyor bankka zapros beradi, ya'ni o'sha standby akkreditivni ochish uchun zapros beradi va undan keyingi etap importyor bank standby akkreditivni ochadi va eksportyorga jo'natadi, eksportyor bankka jo'natadi. Eksportyor bank eksportyor o'zi bilan bu bilan maslahatlashadi va 5-etapda ko'rib turibsizlar, mahsulotlar o'zi yetkazib beriladi. Odatda o'sha 6-12 oy ichida, o'sha qancha muddatga berilgan bo'lsa, 6-12 oy ichida o'sha bir necha marta mahsulotlarni yetkazib berishi mumkin. Undan keyin 6-etap bizda o'sha importyor eksportyorga pulini to'lab beradi. Lekin bunda shunaqa holatlar bo'lishi mumkin. Bu standby akkreditivlarda agarda importyor to'lovni amalga oshirmasa, to'lovni amalga oshirmaydigan bo'lib qolgan paytda keyingi etaplarga o'tish mumkin. Ya'ni 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 bosqichlarga albatta o'tiladi. Qachonki importyor eksportyorga pulni to'lab bermagan paytda bu bosqichlarga o'tiladi. Iloji boricha bu bosqichlar o'zi ko'pincha sodir bo'lmaydi, lekin bu bosqichlar ham o'sha protsessni o'z ichiga oladi agar o'sha importyor eksportyorga pulni to'lab bermasa.
So one other thing I would point out about standby LCs is that there are two main types of standby LC. There is financial and non-financial. And it's important when you are issuing a standby LC that you correctly categorize it as either financial or non-financial. And the reason for that is because of the capital that these products consume. If it's a financial standby LC, it's treated as 100% weighted from a capital perspective and consumes more capital than the non-financial. Non-financials are weighted at 50% for capital purposes. So you can see, depending on the type of standby LC that you're issuing, if it's a financial one, a direct credit substitute is another way of defining a financial guarantee, a direct credit substitute. You should price accordingly because obviously you are interested in your returns and your returns on capital. And if you are only consuming 50% of the amount of capital for certain types of standby LC, then you have more flexibility in terms of pricing. Scpecialized?
Standby akkreditivlarni ikki xil asosan turi mavjud. Birinchisi bu finansiviy va finansiviy emas turi mavjud. Bunda asosan o'sha ikkita kategoriyaga ajraladi va standby akkreditiv ishlatishdan oldin biz aniq bilib o'tishimiz kerak, qaysi finansiviy turdagi akkreditivga kiradimi yoki nofinansiviy akkreditivga kiradimi. Bunda asosan o'sha kapital katta rol o'ynaydi. Finansiviyda asosan 100% kapital ishlatiladi. Finansiviy bo'lmagan turida bu 50% kapital ishlatilgan bo'ladi. O'shaning uchun birinchi standby akkreditiv chiqarishdan oldin biz qilishimiz kerak, что bu yoki finansiviy akkreditiv, standby akkreditivligini.
And these particular products have very significant revenue potential for the bank. I can give you an example of a transaction that I was involved in Timor-Leste in the Pacific. We were issuing a standby LC for $70 million over a period of 3 years against a Korean bank counter guarantee. So it's like a back-to-back standby LC. We were charging almost 1.75%. We generated $3.5 $3.5 million in fees over the 3-year period. So you can see these products, standby LCs, especially when they're associated with bid bonds, performance bonds, etc., can generate huge amounts of revenue for the bank. So I just highlight that because it's obviously banks are interested in generating revenues, and these products can generate significant revenue. Shakboz?
Standby akkreditivlar odatda juda ham katta dohod olib keladi. Buni bilib o'tishimiz kerak. Masalan, qilib aytganda, shunaqa bo'lgan 2 million 3 yilga akkreditiv chiqarilgan, ya'ni standby akkreditiv chiqarilgan o'sha Koreya banki garantiyasi asosida va bu o'sha 1.7% dan hisoblangan va o'sha yillar davomida 3.5 million dohodni olib kelgan. Yes, Roger.
Great.
Оборот olib kelgan, uzr. Yes, Roger.
Okay. Let's move on then. If there's no questions on standby LCs, we'll move on to the second specialized type of LC, which is a red clause LC. So a red clause LC is a normal LC, but with a condition that, or a clause that allows the beneficiary, who is the exporter, to take a pre-shipment advance. So red clause LCs, pre-shipment finance. A red clause LC incorporates a special clause authorizing the advising or confirming bank to make a pre-shipment advance to the beneficiary against a simple receipt and a draft. A draft is a bill of exchange. So it's a little bit like a prepayment under an LC for a percentage value of the LC. So typically a red clause advance might be for 30%, 40%, maybe more, but typically for a smaller amount, certainly not the full value of the LC. So just the background to these LCs. Historically, these LCs were used for wool trade, when wool was being exported from Australia to Europe, and there were regular sales of wool every week at the wool sales in the countryside. But the wool merchants didn't have enough money, enough working capital themselves to go ahead and purchase the wool. So they required, or they needed to be able to draw down the LC in advance to have the cash to be able to purchase the wool. So red clause LCs were so named because they allowed this, and the clause was originally written in red ink on the LC because this is before SWIFT. They were issued via mail. And on the mail LC, typewritten LC, the red clause was in red ink to draw the attention to the exporting bank. And then the nominated bank makes the advance strictly in terms of conditions of the red clause, and then proceeds of negotiation are applied in repayment of the advance plus interest in accordance with the issuing bank's instructions. So in this type of LC, the risk is being taken by the issuing bank and ultimately the applicant, the importer, because there could be an advance under a red clause LC, 30, 40, 50%, whatever the LC allows for, but there's no guarantee that goods will be shipped. And if the goods are not shipped, then the issuing bank will still have to pay, reimburse under the red clause, and the applicant will still have to reimburse the issuing bank under the red clause. So they will suffer a loss in the event that no goods are shipped. So from the export perspective, from the export bank's perspective, this is a better solution than the packing credit that we looked at last time, because here the exporting bank is not taking the risk is being taken by the import side, the issuing bank and the applicant. Okay, Shakboz?
Agar standby akkreditivlari haqida hech qanaqangi savollaring bo'lmasa, unda red clause akkreditivlarni turlariga o'tishimiz mumkin. Red clause akkreditivlari asosan ishlatiladi. Bunda o'sha shunaqangi bir sharti bo'ladiki, mahsulotlar yetkazib berilishidan oldin benefitsarga o'sha berilgan summadagi pulni to'lab berish kerak. Masalan, bu bo'lishi mumkin, ya'ni avans to'lovini to'lab berish kerak. 30-40% yoki 50% avans to'lovini benefitsarga to'lab berish kerak bo'ladi. O'sha berilgan chek yoki nimani akkreditivni draftiga qarab. Tarixdan ma'lumki, Red Clause LC'lar asosan ishlatilgan Avstraliyada ishlatilgan birinchi o'sha yung, ya'ni qo'ylarni yungini savdo sotig'ini qilishda ishlatilgan va o'sha nimalarda importyorlarda to'liq o'sha yetarli darajada pul bo'lmagan nimalarni birdaniga to'lovni amalga oshirish uchun o'shaning uchun Red Clause LC'lar ishlatilgan va o'sha Swift xati chiqarilishidan oldin u paytlar Swift xati bo'lmagan va undan oldin o'sha varag'iga akkreditivga qizil rangdagi harflar bilan yozilgani uchun Red Clause LC hisoblangan. Lekin bu Red Clause LCda o'sha berilgan shartda bo'ladi. O'sha shartida importyor bank birinchi to'lovni amalga oshirib berish kerak eksportyorga berilgan miqdordagi 30%, 40% yoki 50% miqdordagi. Bitta asosan importyor bank va importyor tomonidan risk o'z zimmasiga olinadi, chunki agarda mahsulotlar yetkazib berilmasa eksportyor tomonidan, unda importyor bankka to'lovni amalga oshirib berish kerak va importyor bankka to'lovni to'lab berish kerak. O'shanga bitta eksportyor tomonidan hech qanaqangi risk o'z zimmasiga olinmayapti, balki importyor bank va importyor tomoniga risk ko'proq tushadi. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So that is Red Clause, pre-shipment finance. Then revolving LCs. And these types of LCs are used for regular repeat shipments. So revolving documentary credit are renewed or reinstated without specific amendments to the LC being required. These LCs are used by traders who have regular shipments from the same supplier over an extended period. They dispense with the need for frequent amendments, value and timings, and are cheaper as a result. A revolving LC may revolve around time or around value. I'll just let you cover the definition to start with, Sheklos. Hi, Sheklos. You're on mute, Sheklos.
Perhaps it's some connectivity issue.
Yes, I'm here. So I had like kind of drawing tools got set up this way. I didn't know how to actually turn it off. So yeah, I will give a definition to the revolving LCs in that case. Revolving akkreditivlar bu o'sha takrorlanadigan akkreditivlar hisoblanadi va akkreditiv ishlab chiqariladi o'sha spetsialniy situatsiyalarda, qachonki o'sha savdo sotiqni amalga oshirayotgan tomonlar o'sha bitta aytaylik importyor o'sha bitta eksportyordan berilgan qanaqadir uzoq muddatda va bir xil summada o'sha akkreditivni tez amalga oshirilsa, o'shanda kamroq, arzonroq tushishi uchun revolving akkreditivlar asosan ishlatiladi. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So around time or value. So ones that revolve around time are that they are established for a fixed period, for fixed amounts, and are valid for fixed periods. For example, a revolving LC available for US dollars 50,000 per month for a fixed period of 6 months. It is automatically available for 50,000 each month, irrespective of whether any drawings were made during the previous month. So an LC of this nature could be cumulative or non-cumulative. Considering the above example, cumulative means that if there's no drawing in the prior month, you can catch up in the subsequent month. So if you didn't draw in month 1 for 50,000, you could draw 100,000 in month 2. The opposite is true for non-cumulative. If you failed to draw 50,000 in the first month, then you can't make it up in the second month. However, in both the cases, the issuing bank's liability under this revolving LC will be 300,000. That's 50,000 times 6 months. And the importer's line, the applicant's line, will be earmarked accordingly. So he needs a facility of 300,000 to establish a 50,000 revolving LC, which is available for 50,000 for 6 months. Thank you, Scpecialized.
Masalan, bunga misol qilib aytsak, revolverivание aktivlar o'sha berilgan fiksирование berilgan muddatga fiksирование berilgan summada bo'ladi. Masalan, misol qilib aytaylik, $50,000 har oy 6 oyga hisoblanadigan bo'lsa, unda o'sha har oy $50,000 beriladi. Faqatgina holatlarda o'sha bir oy oldin qanaqadir o'zgartirishlar yoki to'lov amalga oshirilmagan bo'lsa, o'sha akkreditiv bunda kumulativ va non kumulativ bo'lishi mumkin. Bunda bu aytiladiki, o'sha kumulativ deganda tushunamiz, agar $50,000 drawing agar shu oy qilinolmagan bo'lsa yoki o'tgan oy qilinmagan bo'lsa, unda keyingi oy bu $100,000 drawing qilish mumkin. Non kumulativ bo'lsa, agar o'tgan oy o'sha drawing qilishdan qila olmagan bo'lsa, imkoniyati bo'lmagan bo'lsa, unda keyingi oyga o'sha drawing qilish yo'qolib ketadi. Bunda asosan o'sha aytaylik, ikkita banklarni ham o'ziga обязательство oladi, что $300,000 berishga, chunki o'sha akkreditiv $50,000 dan 6 oyga chiqarilyapti. O'shaning uchun $300,000 berish banklarga обязательство hisoblanib qoladi agar revolving akkreditiv chiqarsa. Yes, Roger.
Okay, so that's time. Then we have value. So revolving LCs that revolve around value are reinstated to the original value within a given overall period of validity. The LC provides for automatic reinstatement upon presentation of specified documents. So for example, an LC revolving around value for 50,000 and for a 6 months period, the beneficiary can present documents up to a value of 50,000 during the 6-month period and can make any number of such drawings. So he can make multiple drawings of 50,000. The LC will revert back to its original value of 50,000 each time a set of documents is presented and subsequently negotiated and paid by the nominated and issuing bank. So the problem with this type of LC is that the liability of the issuing bank and the applicant becomes incalculable, because there could be multiple drawings. There could be one drawing today, another drawing tomorrow, another drawing the next day. So the question is, you don't know how much to record in terms of a liability against the customer's facility. So to give a degree of control, issuing banks will do one of the following things. They will either insert an overall cap in terms of the value of the LC. For example, they may say drawings cannot exceed 500,000 in total, or they may include a advice of reinstatement. And by doing this, they effectively issue a amendment each time to say that the LC is available again for drawing. So this really does detract from the value or detract from the nature of a revolving LC, and really is not a true revolving LC. But the point I would like to make in terms of revolving LCs that revolve around value is that banks must somehow cap their liability and record it against the customer's facility. So you have to use one of these two methods, either a cap or a reinstatement amendment, as a way of maximizing or limiting your liability. Scpecialized?
Revolvирование akkreditivlar asosan aytib o'tganimizdek ishlatiladi. O'sha bitta fiksirованный berilgan muddatga fiksirованный berilgan summa orqali ishlatiladi va bunda har xil drawinglar amalga oshirish mumkin. Aytib o'tganimizdek, masalan, misol qilib aytganda bunda $50,000 6 oyga deb hisoblasak, unda o'sha benefitsar hujjatlarni berish kerak. O'sha $50,000 6 oyga muddat uchun hujjatlarni berish kerak va o'sha 6 oy ichida bu har xil yana drawingni amalga oshirish mumkin va bu summasi o'zgarishi ham mumkin keyinchalik. O'shanga nima akkreditivlar o'zini original summasiga $50,000 summasiga har doim qaytadi, har bir oy boshlangan paytida va o'sha oy ichida har xil hajmdagi drawinglarni amalga oshirish mumkin, ya'ni benefitsar yoki importyor tomon amalga oshirish mumkin. Bunda faqat bitta muhim muammo kelib chiqishi mumkin o'sha importyor va importyor bank tomonidan, chunki bunaqangi drawinglar har kuni amalga oshirish mumkin. Masalan, bugun birinchi drawing, ertangi kuni ikkinchi drawing. O'shanda har xil chalkash qanaqadir bir banklar o'rtasida yoki importyor va importyor bank o'rtasida ozgina bir-biridan chalg'ib ketish bo'lishi mumkin. Faqatgina shu muammo bo'lishi mumkin bu revolvирование akkreditivlarda, lekin qolgan muammolar, boshqa muammolar bo'lmaydi, chunki buni asosiy foydali tomonlaridan bittasi o'sha qachonki benefitsar, ya'ni benefitsar va importyor o'rtasida aytaylik savdo olib borilayotganda berilgan muddatda ortiqcha xarajatlarni yo'qotish mumkin bu revolvирование akkreditiv tomonidan. O'shaning uchun asosan shuning uchun bu akkreditiv turi ishlatiladi. Yes, Roger.
Okay. So the main reasons for using a revolving LC are to save on cost and to reduce administration so that you don't have to issue LCs regularly every month. So that covers revolving LCs. I'd just like to check to see if anybody has any questions on anything we've covered so far. So we've covered standby LCs, red clause LCs, and revolving LCs before we move into transferables and back-to-backs.
Asosan revolvирование akkreditivlarni ishlatishni maqsadi ortiqcha xarajatlarni yo'qotish, o'shaning uchun ishlatiladi. Agar savollar bor bo'lsa, hozir berish mumkin. O'sha revolvирование va standby akkreditivlari haqida keyingi akkreditiv turlariga o'tishimizdan oldin.
No questions? If there's no questions, we'll move on to transferable and back-to-back.
No questions, Roger.
Okay, so transferable and back-to-back LCs are fairly similar. They're similar in the sense that these products are used by middlemen. By middlemen, I mean people that import and then export, or buy and then sell. And both legs are under LC. So back-to-backs, transferables used by middleman. And I'll be talking about it from the middleman's perspective. So you are sitting in the middle and you are the banker of the middleman, and your customer is buying and selling under LC. Scpecialized?
Transferable akkreditiv turlari, transferable va back-to-back akkreditiv turlari bir-biriga juda ham o'xshash akkreditiv turlar hisoblanadi, chunki bu yerda o'sha o'rtada bitta odam bo'ladi, ya'ni buni balki o'rtakash deb aytishimiz mumkin. O'sha o'rtada bitta odam bo'ladi, ya'ni aytaylik importyor va eksportyor o'rtasidagi odam bo'lishi mumkin. Va bugun biz hozir o'sha importyor va eksportyorning o'rtasidagi odamni bank tomonidan gapiramiz va bunday qilib aytganda, ya'ni o'sha bizni o'zimiz mahsulot sotib olyapti, mahsulot sotyapti. Ya'ni biz o'rtada o'sha mijozimizni banki bo'lib, o'rtadagi o'sha transfer qiladigan bank bo'lib turibmiz. O'shani perspektivida hozir aytib tushuntirib o'tamiz. Yes, Roger.
So let's start then with transferable LCs. Transferable documentary credit is one that can be transferred by the original first beneficiary to one or more second beneficiaries. So you can have multiple second beneficiaries, multiple suppliers, typically used when the first beneficiary does not supply the merchandise but is a middleman and wishes to transfer part or all of his rights and obligations to the actual supplier, who will be the second beneficiary. Shipment of goods is directly from the second beneficiary to the transfer LC applicant, so the ultimate buyer. Shekboz, I'll let you cover that.
Yes. Odatda bu transferable akkreditiv turlari ishlatiladi o'sha birinchi benefitsardan birinchi benefitsardan o'sha importyorga yetkazib berish uchun. Ya'ni bunda aytishimiz mumkinki, importyor bitta, lekin eksportyor ikkita bo'lishi mumkin. Ya'ni o'sha ikkinchi eksportyorimiz bu o'sha o'rtadagi odam hisoblanadi. Bunda aytaylik, o'rtadagi odam qanaqadir o'sha mahsulotni bir qismini yoki mahsulotni bir qismini yoki hammasini sotish, hammasini yetkazib berish majburiyatini birinchi benefitsarga berishi mumkin va birinchi benefitsar hamma mahsulotni o'sha importyorga yetkazib beradi. O'shanda bu transfer akkreditivlar shunda ishlatiladi. Asosan o'sha eski ikkita eksportyor bo'ladi, bitta importyorga mahsulot yetkazib beradi. Yes, Roger.
So what's possible with a transferable LC? The transferable LC must comply with UCP 600 Article 38. So there's a specific article in UCP that covers transferable LCs and what is allowed and what is not allowed. So a transfer LC can be transferred only on the terms and conditions specified in the original LC, with the exception of the amount can be reduced, the unit price can be reduced, the expiry date can be reduced, the period of presentation can be shortened, reduced, the shipment date can be reduced. All of those can change if the middleman wishes to change those. In addition, the insurance percentage may be increased and the name of the applicant can be substituted for that of the middleman. So in other words, the original applicant of the LC, his name, the buyer in the LC, that name can be changed to the middleman's name so that it appears as though the middleman is the applicant of the transferred LC. Shakboz?
Transferable akkreditivlar o'sha har doim UCP 600 art 38 qonun qoidalariga rioya qilish kerak har doim va o'sha berilgan qonun qoidalari va majburiyatlarini ko'rsatib o'tilgan shu nimada UCP 600 art 38 da transferable akkreditivlar asosan ishlatiladi o'sha berilgan original akkreditivda faqatgina quyidagi o'zgartirishlar kiritish mumkin va o'shanda aytaylik importyor tomonidan importyor va importyor bank tomonidan akkreditiv chiqarildi va o'sha middleman, ya'ni o'rtadagi odamga va o'rtadagi bankka berildi, ya'ni o'sha ikkinchi eksportyorga. Bu ikkinchi eksportyor o'rtadagi o'sha bank bu akkreditivni olib summasini kamaytirib yozishi mumkin yoki har bitta mahsulotni har bitta donasini narxini kamaytirib yozishi mumkin. Berilgan akkreditivni muddatini berilgan mahsulotni yaroqlilik muddatini pasaytirib yozish mumkin yoki o'sha bundan tashqari yetkazib berish datasini o'zgartirib yozish mumkin va o'sha quyidagi aytib o'tganlarim hammasi pastga tushirish mumkin va qo'shimcha qilib aytganda sug'urta foizi ko'proq qilib yozilishi mumkin va o'sha berilgan nima o'rtadagi bank va o'rtadagi odam o'zini ismini akkreditivga yozishi mumkin chem o'sha importyorni ismini olib tashlab, ya'ni bu yerda bu o'rtadagi odam shunaqa qilishi mumkinki o'sha eksportyorga hujjat yetkazib berishi mumkin то что shu o'rtadagi odam haqiqiy importyor, lekin bu o'rtadagi odam o'zi importyor emas, o'zi hujjatlarni o'sha mahsulotlarni olib haqiqiy importyorga yetkazib berishi mumkin. Shuni o'zgartirishlar kirgizishi mumkin bu transferable accreditivda. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So the transfer itself is effected on the written instruction of the first beneficiary by the transferring bank. The transferred LC is simply an advice and does not constitute any obligation on the part of the transferring bank, unless the original LC was confirmed by that bank, which is not normally the case. So the transferring bank does not therefore require a credit limit to transfer an LC. This is a major benefit for the bank and for the customer, the middleman, that he does not require a trade facility to transact with transferable LCs, because the LC is being transferred without responsibility or engagement on the part of the transferring bank. Normally, payment is only made by the transferring bank to the first and second beneficiaries upon receipt of the proceeds from the issuing bank. This mitigates the risk even further. So I'll just let you cover that, Shaqboz, and then we'll go through the flow of a transferable LC.
Okay. O'sha transfer, ya'ni bir-biriga o'tkazib berish qachonki amalga oshiradi, qachonki o'sha birinchi benefitsar yozma instruksiyalariga asoslanib o'sha birinchi benefitsarni bank tomonidan, ya'ni birinchi eksportyor bank tomonidan o'sha transferred accreditive hech qanaqa majburiyatni o'z zimmasiga olmaydi, qachonki akkreditiv tasdiqlanmasa, o'sha o'rtadagi bank tomonidan akkreditiv tasdiqlanmasa, hech qanaqa majburiyatni o'z zimmasiga olmaydi va undan tashqari eng asosiy foydali tomonlardan bittasi o'sha o'rtadagi, ya'ni transferring bank, ya'ni o'rtadagi bank, ya'ni eksportyor bilan importyor, haqiqiy eksportyor bilan importyor o'rtasida turgan bank hech qanaqangi kredit limitni majburiyatini so'ramaydi o'sha akkreditivni yetkazib berish uchun. Odatda to'lov amalga oshiriladi o'sha o'rtadagi transferring bank tomonidan, ya'ni o'rtadagi bank tomonidan birinchi va ikkinchi benefitsarga o'sha, ya'ni qachonki importyorni banki hujjatlarni olib va akkreditiv chiqargandan keyin bu albatta riskni anchagina kamaytiradi. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So apologies, this is a quite complex looking flow chart, but let's just take it step by step. To start with, you can see we have 6 boxes. Remember, we are working with the middleman. So we are the first advising transferring bank. We're sitting in the middle of this flow chart. Just highlight that to everybody, Shaqboz, before I go on, please.
Okay. Ya'ni mana shu sikl bo'yicha ishlaydi, ya'ni shu protsessni o'z ichiga oladi. O'sha transferable accreditiv turi. Hozir biz o'rtadagi, mana ko'rib turibsizlar, 6 ta aytaylik quti mavjud. O'shanda o'rtadagi middleman, ya'ni o'sha middlemanni bank tomonidan biz bo'lib gapiramiz, ya'ni first advising and transferring bank deb yozib qo'yilgan. O'sha tomonidan gapiramiz. Bizda ko'rib turibsizlar, bizda bor buyer, ya'ni zayavshik, o'sha sotib oluvchi, ya'ni importyor. Ikkinchisi keyin bu bor bizda first beneficiary, ya'ni birinchi beneficiar, ya'ni birinchi eksportyor. Undan keyin bizda bor second beneficiary, ya'ni ikkinchi eksportyorimiz bor. O'shanda biz o'rtadagi bank sifatida hozir gapirib, bu etapni tushuntirib o'tamiz. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So we have commercial contracts. We have the buyer who goes to his bank at step 2 and requests the issuance of an LC. That LC needs to be designated as being transferable. That LC gets issued at step 3, just in the normal way any LC gets issued via SWIFT MT700. That LC is then advised on to the first beneficiary, the middleman, at step 4. Now, this is where things change. At step 5, the middleman requests that the LC be transferred in part or in full to a second beneficiary. So a transfer request in writing from the middleman to the transferring bank, step 5. If agreeable, the transferring bank will go ahead and transfer the LC to the second beneficiary. It will do so through a second advising bank in the exporter's country, in the second beneficiary's country. Step 6, they will authenticate the LC. Step 7, advise it to the second beneficiary at step 7. Then goods can be shipped. Note that goods have to go directly from the second beneficiary to the original applicant of the transferable LC at step 8. Goods cannot go into the middleman. So the goods are shipped at step 8, and then the flow comes back. I'll stop there and I'll let you go up to step 8. Shakboz.
Okay. O'sha siklda ko'rib turibsizlar, birinchi bo'ladigan narsa bu birinchi etap, bu savdo kontraktlari tuzib o'tiladi, ya'ni kim tomonidan? Bunda sotib oluvchi, ya'ni importyor tomonidan va o'rtadagi odam tomonidan birinchi benefitsiar va undan keyin birinchi benefitsiar va ikkinchi benefitsiar o'rtasida ham savdo kontraktlari tuzib o'tiladi va undan keyin o'sha importyor, ya'ni sotib oladigan odam o'zini banki, ya'ni importyor bankka murojaat qiladi o'sha akkreditiv akkreditiv chiqarish uchun, ya'ni ikkinchi etapda, ya'ni aytilgan transferable LC application. Aytaylik $100,000 o'sha transferable akkreditiv zaprosini beradi o'sha importyor bankka va importyor bank bu hujjatlarni olgandan keyin o'sha MT700 shartlariga javob beradigan bo'lsa, bu oladida va uchinchi etapda o'sha o'rtadagi bankni, ya'ni birinchi benefitsiarni bankga akkreditivni chiqarib yuboradi va undan keyin birinchi benefitsiar banki akkreditivni olib turib nima bilan gaplashadi. To'rtinchi etapda biz ko'rib turibmiz o'sha transferable akkreditiv nimani, ya'ni o'rtadagi odam, ya'ni birinchi benefitsiarga beriladi va birinchi benefitsiar zapros beradi o'zini bankiga, ya'ni transferable akkreditiv chiqarish uchun zapros beradi va o'sha birinchi benefitsiar banki, ya'ni o'rtadagi bank bu hujjatlarni olib turib MT700 ga javob beradigan bo'lsa, hamma shartlariga javob beradigan bo'lsa, unda 6-chi etapda biz ko'rib turibmiz o'sha transferable akkreditivga ikkinchi benefitsiarni bankiga jo'natiladi va ikkinchi benefitsiarni banki bu akkreditivni olgandan keyin xuddi shu protsess davom etadi va 7-chi etapda o'zini o'sha ikkinchi benefitsiar bilan maslahatlashadi va ikkinchi benefitsiarga beradi bu akkreditivni va ikkinchi benefitsiar albatta 7-chi etapda, 8-chi etapda hamma o'sha mahsulotlarni yetkazib beradi sotib oluvchiga, ya'ni importyorga o'sha mahsulotlarni hammasini yetib beradi. Lekin biz bitta ishonch hosil qilishimiz kerak, har doim boshqa ikkinchi benefitsiar har doim sotib oluvchiga mahsulotlarni yetkazib berishga, birinchi benefitsiarga emas, sotib oluvchi. Yes.
So in this example, we've said the original LC is for 100,000, but when it was transferred to the second beneficiary, it was transferred for 75,000. And the difference of 25,000 represents the middleman's profit margin. So now that goods are shipped, the second beneficiary can present his documents into his bank at step 9. That bank will check the documents and then send the documents off to the first advising transferring bank at step 10. Now, of course, those documents are for 75,000 and they include the invoice from the second beneficiary. So what now needs to happen is that the middleman needs to supply fresh invoice and draft for 100,000, and those documents are substituted for the original invoice and draft presented by the second beneficiary. So now we have new invoice, new draft for $100,000 at step 11. Those documents can then be sent off to the issuing bank at step 12. And if the documents are fully compliant at step 12, the issuing bank will pay 100,000. When the transferring bank receives that 100,000 at step 13, it can then go ahead and make the payment to the middleman and to the second advising bank. One for 25,000 to the middleman, his profit, and the other 75,000 to the second advising bank for the second beneficiary. Once they receive the money into their Nostro account, they will go ahead and pay the second beneficiary. And I should have said at step 14, there will be an exchange of documents for cash between the issuing bank and the applicant. And that would complete the transferable LC cycle. Jack Boz?
Endi 8-etapda o'sha mahsulotlar importyorga yetkazib bergandan keyin ikkinchi benefitsiar tomonidan undan keyingi etap bizda o'sha 9-etap, ya'ni ko'rib turibsizlar 9-etapda ya'ni hujjatlar ikkinchi benefitsiar tomonidan hujjatlar ikkinchi benefitsiar bankiga yetkazib beriladi va ikkinchi benefitsiar o'sha bank hujjatlarni hammasini ko'rib chiqqandan keyin va tasdiqlanganidan keyin o'sha akkreditivni shartlariga binoan va bundan birinchi benefitsiarni bankiga yetkazib beradi bu hujjatlarni hammasini. 10-etapda hamma hujjatlarni birinchi benefitsiar banki qabul qilib olgandan keyin bu hujjatlarni tekshirib chiqadi va undan keyin birinchi benefitsiar, ya'ni birinchi benefitsiar banki hujjatlarni o'sha o'rtadagi odam, ya'ni birinchi benefitsiarga yetkazib beradi va birinchi benefitsiar bitta hujjatlarni almashtiradi. Ya'ni chunki ko'rib turibsizlar, akkreditiv o'zi $100,000 chiqarilgan akkreditivni $75,000 ikkinchi benefitsiarga, $25,000 birinchi benefitsiarga o'tkazildi. O'shaning uchun 10-etapda $75,000 chiqarilgan hujjatlarni o'rtadagi odam $100,000 qilib yangi invoice, yangi nakladnoy turib almashtiradi. Almashtirgandan keyin bu hujjatlarni olib turib birinchi benefitsiar banki, ya'ni importyor bankiga yetkazib beradi. 12-etapda ko'rib turibsizlar, importyorga yetkazib bergandan keyin importyor bu hujjatlarni olib turib hamma o'sha bu hujjatlarga binoan, ya'ni chunki o'rtadagi bank $100,000 yangi invoice, yangi hujjatlar qilindi, o'sha $100,000 uchun to'lovni amalga oshiradi. Ya'ni 13-etapda to'lov amalga oshiradi va 13-etapda to'lovni amalga oshirgandan keyin 14-etapda o'sha hujjatlar chiqariladi va berilgan o'sha to'lov uchun hujjatlar chiqariladi va $25,000 birinchi benefitsiarga, $75,000 ikkinchi benefitsiarga to'lov amalga oshiriladi va bu o'shanda, ya'ni o'sha birinchi benefitsiar va ikkinchi benefitsiar banklariga to'lovlar amalga oshirilgandan keyin bu banklar birinchi benefitsiar o'zini bankiga, ikkinchi benefitsiar o'zini bankiga, birinchi benefitsiar banki o'zini birinchi benefitsiarga, ikkinchi benefitsiar banki ikkinchi benefitsiarga to'lovlarni amalga oshiradi. Ya'ni birinchi benefitsiar $25,000 to'lovni qabul qiladi, ikkinchi benefitsiar 75,000 miqdordagi to'lovni qabul qiladi. Ko'rib turibsizlar, bu yerda birinchi benefitsiar $25,000 foydani amalga oshirgani yaqqol namoyon bo'ladi. Bu o'sha transferable akkreditiv turini ishlashi hisoblanadi. Yes, Roger.
Very good, thank you. So that is the completion of the transferable LC. In summary, I would say it's a very good product if you can work within the constraints of UCP Article 38, and always remember that the goods have to go directly from the supplier to the ultimate buyer. Any questions on transferables before we move on to back-to-back?
Bu albatta juda ham yaxshi akkreditiv tur hisoblanadi. Qachonki o'sha biz UCP 38-banddagi aytilgan narsalarga qarab o'sha majburiyatlarga va shartlarga binoan ishlasak, back to back akkreditivlarga o'tishimizdan oldin qanaqadir savollaring bo'lsa, bemalol savollarni berishlaring mumkin.
Okay, no questions, then we'll push on. So back-to-back
Yes, Roger,
LC.
no questions.
Thanks, Amrutha. So back-to-back LC is one which is issued in favour of the supplier at the request of the middleman against the security of a master LC. The terms and conditions of a back-to-back, also known as a baby LC, should mirror the terms and conditions of the master LC as far as possible. So mirror is the safest and least risky type of back-to-back. Nevertheless, there is a greater degree of flexibility with back-to-back LCs, and variations in the terms and conditions can occur. When there are variations, we call it in support back-to-back. The riskiest type of back-to-back is a LC called a front-to-back. And this is where the baby LC is issued before the master LC has been received. And this type of back-to-back is called to arrive. Obviously, this is the riskiest because you're issuing the baby LC before you know what the terms and conditions are in the master LC. That's why it's the most risky. The bank issuing the baby LC must take care to keep the variations to a minimum, as the more variations, the greater the chance of documents not complying with the terms and conditions of the master LC. The bank may then be left in a position where they have to make payment under the baby LC but cannot be reimbursed under the master LC. Shakboz?
Okay, so Roger, I got one thing that the master LC is the security for the middleman, right? As I understood.
It's the security for the middleman's banker. It's also security for him in a way, but mainly for his bank.
Okay, got it. Ko'rib turibsizlar, back-to-back akkreditivlari ishlashini asosiy nimalari, asosiy qoidasida bu ikkita akkreditiv bo'ladi. Birinchisi master akkreditiv, ikkinchisi baby akkreditiv. Master akkreditiv bu o'sha o'rtadagi odam, ya'ni o'sha nimada ko'rib turganimizdek, o'sha o'rtadagi odam yoki savdogar deylik, o'shani bankini xavfsizligi uchun master akkreditivi ishlatiladi va undan tashqari berilgan shartlar va berilgan shartlar asosan o'sha baby akkreditivda ko'rsatilib o'tiladi. Bitta asosan katta risk bo'lishi mumkin qachonki baby akkreditiv master akkreditivdan birinchi chiqarilganda, ya'ni front to back, ya'ni oldindan orqaga bo'lganida. Chunki hali master akkreditivda qanaqangi shartlar yoki majburiyatlar bor bo'lishini bilmasimizdan oldin baby akkreditivni ishlab chiqarganimizda, o'shanda shu albatta juda ham katta risk bo'lishi mumkin. Asosiy riski shu hisoblanadi va bundan tashqari o'sha baby akkreditivni chiqarayotgan bank o'zgarishlarni kamaytirish kerak, ya'ni hujjatlardagi o'zgarishlarni kamaytirish kerak va o'sha master akkreditivini shartlari va qonun qoidalariga javob beradigan hujjatlardagi o'zgarishlarni kamaytirish kerak va o'shanga iloji boricha javob berdirishga asosan harakat qilish kerak. Yes, Roger.
Very good. So some considerations. A back-to-back is a separate LC. and the middleman will require a facility to establish such LCs. The master LC is held by the bank as security. Banks have the following considerations before issuing back-to-back LCs or baby LCs: the financial standing and integrity of the applicant, the middleman, the standing of the master LC issuing bank, careful examination of the terms and conditions of the master LC for workability, consideration as to who is the beneficiary. Are they a reputable company in a good country? The commercial transaction must make sense, e.g. the goods involved must be the same under both LCs. The bank should have control over the goods. Both LCs should call for 3 out of 3 bills of lading, full set of original bills of lading. The bank issuing a baby LC has independent sole obligation to pay if the beneficiary submits compliant documents. If the middleman fails to produce the required documents for substitution, then payment under the master LC may be refused. To mitigate this, a power of attorney is taken from the customer, enabling preparation of required documents by the bank. So just as we had with a transferable LC where the middleman substitute his invoices and drafts, we have the same thing occurring in a back-to-back situation, and he needs to produce fresh invoices and drafts. If he fails to do that, then you would have a discrepancy under the master LC. So in that case, to overcome that problem, the middleman's bank takes a power of attorney so it can prepare the documents on behalf of the customer in the event that the customer fails to produce the documents when required. Over to you, Scpecialized. Hope that's clear.
Yes. So, back-to-back akkreditivlarni asosiy mulohazalaridan bittasi bu aytili back-to-back akkreditivlar bu albatta bir-biridan ya'ni aytili ikki xil bir-biridan alohida akkreditivlar hisoblanadi va o'sha o'rtadagi odam har doim manba so'raydi. O'sha bunaqangi back-to-back akkreditivlarni ishlab chiqarish uchun master akkreditivi o'sha master akkreditivi o'sha o'rtadagi turgan odamni bank tomonidan chiqariladi, chunki o'sha ya'ni o'zini himoya qilish uchun, riskni kamaytirish uchun. O'sha ko'pincha banklarda quyidagi mulohazalar keladi o'sha back-to-back akkreditivlarni chiqarayotgan paytda. Ya'ni bu birinchisi bular bilish kerak finansiy holatini, ya'ni o'rtadagi turgan odamni finansiy holatini bilish kerak va undan tashqari o'rtadagi turgan o'sha ya'ni master akkreditivini ishlab chiqarayotgan bankni finansiy holatini ham bilish kerak, ular qanaqangi holatda, va undan tashqari o'sha juda ham ehtiyotkorlik bilan tekshirib ko'rish kerak o'sha shartlar va berilgan majburiyatlarni, berilgan master LC'ni majburiyatlarini va undan tashqari o'sha ya'ni отчетный statusini ushlab turish kerak. Har doim o'sha benefitsar uchun va undan tashqari berilgan mahsulotlar o'sha va savdo tranzaksiyalari har doim o'sha back-to-back akkreditiv va baby akkreditivni shartlariga har doim bo'ysuna olish kerak va javob berish kerak. Bank har doim kontrol bank har doim o'sha mahsulotlarni boshqarish lavozimini o'zini boshqara olishi kerak har doim va o'sha baby akkreditiv chiqarayotgan bank o'zini mustaqil majburiyatiga ega o'sha to'lovni amalga oshirishga mustaqil majburiyatiga ega agarda benefitsiar hamma shartlarga javob beradigan hujjatlarni taqdim etsa, agarda o'rtadagi turgan odam berilgan o'sha kerakli hujjatlarni taqdim eta olmasa, unda o'sha master akkreditivi nima qilinadi, ya'ni master akkreditivi отказ qilinadi. Bu riskni oldini olish uchun asosan o'sha доверенность olish kerak, ya'ni kimdan, bu nimadan, mijozdan доверенность olish kerak. O'sha berilgan hujjatlarni tayyorla olishi uchun o'sha hujjat bank har doim o'zini mijozidan доверенность olishi kerak. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So here's the flow chart. Again, I apologize for the complexity, but really, if you break it down, it really is just 2 LCs. So we now have 8 boxes rather than 4 boxes because we have 2 separate LCs. We have 1 LC on the import side and we have 1 LC on the export side. And of course, you are sitting again in the middle. So effectively, your customer would be both the beneficiary of the master LC and the applicant of the baby LC. You are the advising bank under the master LC and you are the issuing bank of the baby LC. Check Boz.
Bu bitta mana 8ta o'sha qutida ko'rib turibsizlar, har xil sikl berilgan, ya'ni o'sha back to back akkreditativni ishlash sikli. Birinchisi mana ko'rib turibsizlar, ya'ni bizda bor hozir. Biz hali ham bitta o'rtada turibmiz, ya'ni biz o'sha aytaylik o'rtadagi odamni bankimiz, ya'ni middleman applicant turibdi. Issuing bank baby LC chiqarayotgan odammi, ya'ni baby LC chiqarayotgan bankimiz va undan tashqari o'sha benefitsiar, ya'ni o'rtadagi yana middleman, narigi benefitsiari odamimiz. Bitta bizda 2ta akkreditativ chiqarilyapti, bitta emas, undan oldingi akkreditativ turlarida bitta chiqarilardi. Bunda bo'lsa 2ta akkreditativ chiqarilyapti. Hozir bitta intermeta ko'rib o'tamiz. Yes, Roger.
So I won't go through this slide step by step because I think it's not necessary. You can do that in your own time. It's the key is there and it's self-explanatory. Just the fact that it's 2 LCs is the main point. So let's move into a little case study and you can then compare these 2 payment methods or these 2 types of LC together and to see which is suitable for this particular scenario. So let's say that you have a customer who is a small locally based trading company. They've been trading on a worldwide basis and they have turnover of 10 million. So they're not small, they're a good sized customer. They've been a customer of your bank for 5 years and they have a 1 million trade facility plus a small overdraft. Like many trading companies, they have occasional cash flow difficulties. They're in the process of negotiating a contract to supply 5,000 metric tons of tallow to Vietnam, and the price that they've agreed is $450 per metric ton with an Incoterm of CIF. So your bank is not prepared to increase its exposure. Remember, you have a $1 million facility and the deal needs to be self-financing. The latest developments, BCL, which is your customer, Basic Commodities, your customer, has now located a source of supply in northern France, and the price is euros 360 FOB. So the Incoterm is now FOB, and the price is 360 euros per metric ton. The supplier requires an LC. Today's exchange rate is €1 equals $1.15 US. There's a good chance of repeat business, although at this stage, it should be treated as a one-off transaction. Basic Commodities has asked if your bank will be willing to issue an LC to the supplier. The Vietnamese buyer is willing to issue an LC in favor of BCL. Well, that's good news. So what would be your response? So basically you have back-to-back and transferable as the options. And what I'd like you to do is just to take 2 or 3 minutes just to think about it and to think about which one is most suitable given these this scenario, this case study as a background. Okay, Shakboz, I'll let you explain that, please.
bundan oldingi back-to-back LC'ni berilgan siklni o'zlaring ko'rib olishlaring mumkin. Bemalol işte hamma narsa bitta yozilgan, har bitta qadam. Shuning uchun bizda hozir case study bor, ya'ni misol bitta o'shanda ko'rib o'tamiz. Hozir shartlarni o'qib o'taman va sizlar o'zlaringni javoblarini aytishlaring kerak 1-2 minut o'ylab ko'rib. Aytaylik, o'sha mahalliy joylashgan savdo-sotiq kompaniyasi bor va dunyo bo'yicha savdo qilyapti va uni obroti $10 million hisoblanadi va o'sha bu albatta sizni bankingizni mijozi hisoblanadi 5 yildan beri va 1 millionlik savdo manbasiga ega va kichkina har xil savdolar va undan tashqari bunda naqd pul oqimi muammolari bor va biz bilan hozir переговорlar olib boryapti. Sizni bankingiz bilan переговорlar olib boryapti. O'sha 5000 metr tonna sariyog' yetkazib berish uchun Vyetnamga 450 metr har bir metr tonnasiga $450 o'sha inka shartlari, ya'ni CIF inka shartlari, ya'ni bu degani cost insurance price, ya'ni narx, sug'urta va narx sug'urta va xarajatlarni hisobga olgan holda va sizni bankingiz hali tayyorlanmagan va bu ya'ni bu nimani сделкani amalga oshirishga tayyorlanmagan va bu сделка albatta o'zini o'zi moliyalashtirish orqali amalga oshirilishi kerak. Lekin oxirgi rivojlanishlar, ya'ni o'zgarishlardan ko'rib turibmizki, BCL degan kompaniya, ya'ni Basic Commodities degan kompaniya hozir joylashgan Fransiyada, Shimoliy Fransiyada joylashgan va bular ham xuddi shu ishni amalga oshirishmoqchi, ya'ni har bitta nimasiga €350 va importyor talab qilyapti akkreditiv. Bugungi valyuta, ya'ni dollar bilan yevroni kursi 1 yevro $1.15 ga to'g'ri kelyapti va bunda yaxshi imkoniyat bor bu biznes qayta va qayta takrorlanishiga va bundan tashqari siz bittasini tanlashingiz kerak, yoki transfer yoki back to back, qaysi biri bo'lishi mumkin. Undan tashqari BCL sizni bank so'radi то что o'sha sizni bankingiz akkreditiv chiqarib bera oladimi, ya'ni eksportyorga akkreditiv chiqarib bera oladimi? Vyetnamlik savdogar o'sha akkreditiv chiqarib bera oladi bemalol nimani BCLni tarafiga mos qilib, ya'ni BCL aytgan shartlarga javob berib, o'sha vyetnamlik savdogar bemalol akkreditiv chiqarib bera oladi. Sizni qanaqangi javobingiz bo'lishi mumkin bunda? 1-2 minut o'ylashga vaqt, agar javoblaring bo'lsa bemalol chatga yozishlaring mumkin. Yes, Roger, I've translated, so maybe we can wait 1 or 2 minutes. Yes.
Yes, please. Thank you. Okay, I'm conscious of the time, so we'll push on.
Yes.
So potential solutions, back-to-back and transferable. So if you opt for back-to-back, your bank would need to issue a baby LC against the master LC. Back-to-back credit facility of euros 1.8 million would be required. That's the cost of the goods from the French supplier. Plus, you would need to be comfortable with the Vietnamese issuing bank, and the country limit would need to be in place. Certainly back-to-back offers the maximum flexibility in changing terms and conditions, and it's easier to conceal the identity of the supplier from the buyer. The reason you want to hide the identity of the supplier from the buyer is because, of course, future transactions, if they know who one another are, they will cut out the middleman, or potentially cut out the middleman. So with back-to-back, the middleman could take possession of the goods, he could repackage the goods, rebrand the goods to conceal the identity. One note of caution, it's hard to justify setting up a back-to-back facility for a one-off transaction. You know, you have to get credit approval, you have to document the facility. That's a lot of time and effort to do that just for a one-off transaction. So those some considerations for back-to-back. Scpecialized, I'll let you cover that first.
Back to back akkreditivni agar ishlatadigan bo'lsak, unda o'sha sizni bankingiz ikkita akkreditiv chiqarishga majbur bo'ladi. O'sha birinchisi baby akkreditiv, ikkinchisi master. Undan tashqari o'sha back to back kredit manbasiga javob beradigan, ya'ni 1,8 million yevro chiqarilishi kerak bo'ladi, yevro talab qilinadi, plus Vyetnamda banki va Vyetnamda qanaqangi davlatini limitini bilishimiz kerak bo'ladi. Undan tashqari back to back akkreditiv bizga taklif qiladi to, что maksimum o'zgartirishlar kirgizishi, o'sha akkreditivni shartlari va qonun qoidalariga ko'p o'zgartirishlar kiritishimiz mumkin va bunda juda ham oson o'sha eksportyorni kimligini yashirish juda ham oson bo'ladi back to backda. Va o'sha o'rtadagi odam, ya'ni middleman bemalol o'sha mahsulotlarni boshqarishi mumkin, mahsulotlarni o'ziga qabul qilishi mumkin, o'zini ismini qo'yishi mumkin, yangi brend qo'yishi mumkin. Chunki agarda o'sha importyor haqiqiy eksportyor kimligini bilib qolsa, unda o'rtadagi o'sha middleman keyinchalik kelajakda umuman kerak bo'lmay qolishi mumkin va middleman o'rtadagi ishini yo'qotishi mumkin. Просто bitta back to backni bitta nima tomoni, minus tomoni to, что juda ham qiyin bittagina tranzaksiyaga back to back nimasini akkreditivni qo'yish qiyin bo'ladi. Yes.
Right. Then transferable LC is the other alternative. We said that for transferable LCs, no credit facility is required. So that's a major advantage if you use a transferable. The risk is really operational from the bank's perspective. LC is transferred without responsibility or engagement by the bank. The issuing bank and the country risk exposure is actually taken by the supplier, the French supplier. So they are taking the Vietnamese bank and country risk. Repeat business is not essential, so a one-off is fine. And it's an internationally recognized payment solution supported by ICC Article 38, UCP 600. So I think you can see from that the preferred choice would be a transferable LC if you are able to agree that with the customer. So the next step would be, will the French supplier accept a transferred LC? Because given the choice, the French supplier would rather have a back-to-back. The French supplier, in agreeing to a transferable LC or a transferred LC, is obviously disadvantaged somewhat. So they may not be willing to accept. But if they are, then that is the preferred payment method. Scpecialized?
Transferable aggressivda ko'rib turibsizlar, birinchi afzallik tomoni bu hech qanaqangi kredit limit so'ralmaydi o'sha transferable aggressiv chiqarishga va risk asosan operatsionniy bo'ladi. Undan tashqari nima transferable aggressivlar shu aggressivlar o'tkaziladi, hech qanaqangi sizni bank o'sha sizni bankingiz yoki siz bankingizda qatnashuvi yoki hech qanaqa mas'uliyatini hisobga olmaganda jo'natiladi. Va undan tashqari o'sha importyor banki va davlati riski asosan o'sha Fransiyadagi eksportyor tomonidan o'z zimmasiga olinadi va bu biznesni juda ham takroriy biznes juda ham shart emas, ya'ni bu biznes takrorlanishi shart emas, bir marta qilishga amalga oshirish mumkin va undan tashqari butun jahon tomonidan o'ylab chiqilgan оплата решенияsi, ya'ni to'lov turi hisoblanadi. Bu transferable aggressiv qaysiki ICC UCP 600 ni 38 o'sha bobida deb o'tilganlar. Keyingi etap nima bo'lishi mumkin? O'sha fransuz eksportyor bu transfer aggressivini qabul qiladimi yoki yo'qmi, hozir ko'rib o'tamiz. Yes, Roger.
Right. So, assuming the French supplier is willing to accept a transfer LC, the customer is following your advice, then they're able to structure the deal using a transferable. They've received the LC in their favour from the buyer and have requested a meeting at which they wish to go through the mechanics of the transaction and execute the transfer request. The customer has sent a copy of both the LC and the transfer request to you by fax to enable you to prepare for the meeting. And they've requested that the ultimate buyer and supplier be kept at arm's length to protect future business opportunities. So what you're now asked to do is review the LC and the transfer request and highlight any amendments and or advice that you would give the customer before authorizing the transfer. And are there any other matters that you would like to finalize? So I believe we have shared with you or asked you to print out slides 21, 22, 23, and 24, which are the LC that you have received. 21, 22, and 23 is the LC, and then 24 is the transfer request. So what I'd like you to do now is review those and recommend any or highlight any problems or areas of concern that need to be addressed before you can go ahead and do the transfer. Thank you, Shakboz.
Ko'rib turibsizlar, endi tasavvur qilamiz, то что fransuz eksportyor o'sha transferable aggressiv turini qabul qildi va biz bu qabul qilgandan keyin biz o'sha nimamiz aytaylik mijozimiz biz bilan встреча ko'rishmoqchi bo'ldi va o'sha transferable aggressivni amalga oshirish uchun bizga o'sha zaявка jo'natdi faks orqali. O'sha bugun uchrashuvga tayyorlanishimiz uchun va o'sha BCL bizdan so'radi, то что asosiy sotib oluvchi va sotuvchi, ya'ni eksportyor va importyor bir-biri bilan juda ham yaxshi muomalada bo'ladi, то что keyingi kelajakdagi biznes imkoniyatlarini ushlab qolish uchun. Va biz qilishimiz kerak bo'lgan narsa, ko'rib chiqishimiz kerak o'sha aggressivni va transfer zaявкасini va har xil qanaqadir to'lovlar yoki amendmentlar bo'lsa, o'shalarni aytib o'tishimiz kerak yoki BCLga o'sha hammasini aytib o'tishimiz kerak, transferni, ya'ni transferni amalga oshirishdan oldin. Bu yerda yana har xil muhim faktlar bo'lishi mumkinmi bu tekshiruvni tugatish uchun? Yes, Roger.
Great. So I hope you have managed to print off 21, 22, 23, 24. So I'll just give you a few moments to have a look at the transfer request, compare it with the LC, and highlight any problems that you see. I'll give you 4 minutes.
Ko'rib turibsizlar, transfer request chiqarilgan anaqada slayddir va shuni qarab o'tinglar va agar har xil qanaqadir bitta muammolar yoki problemalar yoki xato topsalaring o'shalarni iltimos belgilab qo'yinglar va bizga aytinglar. O'sha 4 minut beramiz.
Okay, 1 more minute.
Okay. Iltimos o'sha slayddagi nimani transfer requestni, ya'ni zaprosni ko'rib chiqib, agar qanaqadir xatolari bo'lsa, aytishlarini so'raymiz. Hozir kutib turibmiz o'sha agar savollaring bo'lsa yoki har xil qanaqadir xatoni topgan bo'lsanglar, o'shani aytishni.
Okay, then let's go over it. So, first problem we have is that the original LC has or is not designated as transferable. So it must state in the text that it is transferable, and as things stand, that LC that is being received does not state that it is transferable. So that is the first thing that needs to change. The next thing, the currencies don't match. You have US dollars on one side and euros on the other. You're not allowed to change the currencies as per UCP Article 38. So you need to find a way to match the currencies on both sides of the transaction, both in euros or both in US dollars. So somebody will have to agree to change the one of the contracts. The Incoterms don't match. You have FOB and CIF. You need to have the same Incoterms on each side. You cannot have different Incoterms according to UCP Article 38. And it will be very difficult to hide the supplier and the buyer's identities in the current LC. The bill of lading would need to be endorsed by the French supplier, which if it's endorsed by the French supplier, then obviously their name is revealed to the ultimate buyer. So that is a problem. It really needs to be the bill of lading issued or appear to be issued to the order of the middleman and endorsed by the middleman. Other documents would need to be provided by the second beneficiary, the French supplier, again, which will reveal the identity of the supplier to the buyer, which is what we are trying to not to do. So only invoices and drafts may be substituted by the first beneficiary, and the beneficiary certificate requires second beneficiary to submit duplicate documents to the Vietnamese buyer. Again, we can't allow that if we are hiding the identity of the two parties. And we have problems with the dates, the expiry dates and the latest shipment dates in the LC need to be amended. So you can see, as things stand, there are quite a few things that would prevent this transaction from going ahead. But equally, I would suggest that these things are not insurmountable. All of these things can be changed and can be amended, and you can then end up with a workable transaction. Shaqboz?
UCP 638 bandiga qaraganda o'sha ya'ni xatoliklar topildi bu Swift nimasida va akkreditiv xatida transfer requestida. Birinchisi o'sha akkreditivda aytib o'tilmagan to'shda akkreditiv transfer bo'ldi. Bundan tashqari valyutalar bir-biriga to'g'ri kelmaydi. Bir ikkita joylarda yevro, bir ikkita joylarda dollar aytilgan va undan tashqari inko shartlari bir-biriga to'g'ri kelmaydi. Va undan tashqari juda ham qiyin bu akkreditivda bu transfer zaprosda то что ya'ni importyor va eksportyorni kimligini topib olish juda ham oson va kimligini juda ham yashirish juda ham qiyin. Va undan tashqari o'sha nakladная har doim kuchaytirish kerak fransuz eksportyor tomonidan. Qolgan hujjatlar albatta ikkinchi benefitsiar ya'ni ikkinchi benefitsiar tomonidan bemalol taqdim etilishi mumkin. Faqat invoice va draftlar o'zgartirilishi mumkin o'sha birinchi benefitsiar tomonidan, ya'ni aytaylik o'sha o'rtadagi odam tomonidan invoice va draftlar o'zgartirilishi mumkin. Benefitsiar sertifikati benefitsiar sertifikati ikkinchi nimada benefitsiar sertifikati majbur qilinadi, talab qilinadi ikkinchi benefitsiardan o'sha vyetnamlik sotib oluvchiga, ya'ni mijozga duplikatini berish so'raladi, har doim majburiy hisoblanadi va talab qilinadi. Va undan tashqari o'sha tugash muddati va amal qilish muddati va oxirgi shipment ya'ni mahsulotlarni yuborish kunlari original akkreditivda aytib o'tilishi va ko'rsatib o'tilishi. Yes, Roger.
Thank you. So other considerations for this type of transaction, standard pricing should not apply. You can calculate the profit margin of the customer. He's going to make $180,000 less freight costs. So I would suggest an all-in fee of 0.5% with no cap would be reasonable, with 50% of the fee up front in case the transaction does not materialize. So 0.5% of the LC value equals 11,250 in fees. Subsequent transactions, you could consider reducing the fees. In terms of reimbursement, always prudent to only pay once you get paid. So you only pay out once you receive payment from the Vietnamese bank. TT reimbursement is in BCL's favour, so that's already included in the LC, and that will reduce the transit interest period and the payment period. If LC requires confirmation, it would be possible to consider, and you could look at using the ADB TFP program. The fact that it's a one-off transaction is okay, but you would only ever undertake a transfer of an LC for an established customer. You would not do it for a non-customer. You need to have full KYC on your customer before you would do this type of transaction. LC is to be advised through your bank, and the reason for that is to make sure you see any amendments to the LC, subsequent amendments to the LC. Full transactional AML CFT would be required, and a one-off transaction is okay, and it's for a transferable, and it's preferable because you would not want to do a one-off for a back-to-back. Shakboz, to you.
Bundan tashqari oxirgi bundan tashqari mulohazalar bor, ya'ni birinchisi o'sha narxlash, o'sha standart narx bu to'g'ri kelmayapti. Ko'rib turganlaringda menga anaqada transfer zaprosda va undan tashqari BCL o'zi kutganda $180,000 kamroq xarajat qilishni va jo'natish xarajatlarini, lekin u to'g'ri kelmadi. Va bundan tashqari o'sha transaksiya nimalari narxlari ancha tushirildi va bu albatta o'sha nimaga kiradi, pricingga kiradi. Va undan tashqari reimbursement va to'lov tomoniga o'tsak, shunaqa gap borki, har doim to'lash kerak, qachonki siz to'langaningizdan keyin, ya'ni qachonki sizga pulni to'lab berishgandan keyin, undan keyin to'lash kerak. Chunki unutmaylik, biz o'rtadagi o'sha middlemanni, ya'ni o'rtadagi odamni banki sifatida qachonki biz pulni olganimizdan keyin keyingi odamga to'lovni amalga oshirib berishimiz mumkin transferable akkreditivda. Va undan tashqari agarda akkreditiv qanaqadir подтверждение so'raydigan bo'lsa, albatta ADB TFP подтверждениесini bemalol ishlatishimiz mumkin va aytib ketishyapti. Va har doim transferable akkreditivlarni biz amalga oshirishimiz kerak, qachonki o'sha mijozni biz yaxshi bilganimizda, ya'ni bu degani bir mijozni biz bilib olishimiz kerak, to'liq KYC protsessini o'tkazishimiz kerak va qachonki mijozni yaxshi bilganimizdan keyin biz transferable akkreditivni ishlatsak bo'ladi. Va undan tashqari akkreditiv albatta qachonki o'zimizni bank tomonidan ishlatilayotgan paytda o'sha mijozni yaxshi o'rganishimiz kerak. Shu aytib o'tilgan shartlardan bittasi albatta qabul qilinadi va to'g'ri qilinadi. Shu tranzaksiyalar bo'lsa, albatta biz back to back akkreditivni bemalol ishlatsak bo'ladi. Yes, Roger.
Thank you very much. So, just a summary of the differences. Back-to-backs, 2 LCs, transferables, 1 LC. In a back-to-back, the LCs are not designated master or baby, but in a transferable must be designated as being transferable. Issuing bank of baby is obligated to pay against compliant documents, whereas in a transfer, the transfer occurs without obligation by the transferring bank. Subject to UCP 600 for back-to-backs, whereas TFLCs, transferable LCs, are specifically subject to Article 38. back-to-back's more flexible, and a facility is required by the middleman. Whereas for a transferable LC, you can only change things as per Article 38, and the customer doesn't need a facility. So that's just a summary of the differences between the two. We've highlighted the 6 S's once again. We can see that in this type of transaction, we're using the goods as security, we're using the LC as security. It's a short term. They truly are self-liquidating transactions because you have the 2 LCs. You're selective, you're only doing the transactions you wish to do, and size and spread and specific also come into play. So you can see that these are these types of transaction take full advantage of the low risk characteristics of trade. So that, I think, concludes today's session, and I'll happily take any questions. Shakboz, you might wish to just quickly go through that slide, and then we'll see if there's any questions.
Okay. Va xulosa qilib aytganda back to back akkreditiv bilan transferable akkreditivlarni asosiy farqlari back to backda ikkita akkreditiv hisoblanadi, ikkita akkreditiv ishlatiladi, transferable'da faqat bitta akkreditiv. Back to backda master yoki baby akkreditivini ko'rsatib o'tish shart emas, lekin transferable akkreditivda albatta transferableligini ko'rsatib o'tishimiz shart. Back to backda o'sha akkreditiv baby akkreditiv chiqarayotgan bank albatta majburiyatni o'z zimmasiga oladi. O'sha to'lovni amalga oshirib berishga qachonki hujjatlar to'liq bo'layotgan bo'lsa, transferable'da bo'lsa bemalol hech qanaqangi majburiyatni, ya'ni o'rtadagi turgan transferring bank hech qanaqangi majburiyatni o'z zimmasiga olmasligi mumkin. Undan tashqari o'sha back to backda back to backda albatta nimalarga o'zgartirishlar kirgizish mumkin. Har xil aytaylik nimalarni tovarlarni o'ziga olib bemalol o'zgartirishlar kirgizish mumkin. Transferable'da tovarlarga umuman o'zgartirish kirgiza olmaydi, faqat invoice va aytaylik shunga o'xshagan hujjatlarda bemalol o'zgartirishlar kirgizish mumkin. Va undan tashqari o'sha berilgan shart va majburiyatlarni o'zgartirishga kiritish mumkin back to backda va mahsulotlar o'rtada turgan odamga, ya'ni o'sha birinchi benefitsarga, ikkinchi benefitsarga bemalol yetkazib berish mumkin. Lekin transferable'da faqatgina o'sha berilgan 38-bandda aytib o'tilgan shartlarga binoan o'zgartirishlar kirgizish mumkin va har doim o'sha ikkinchi benefitsar, ya'ni eksportyor, haqiqiy eksportyor mahsulotlarni importyorga yetkazib berishi shart va bu asosiy farqlari hisoblanadi. Yes, Roger. Bundan tashqari aytib o'taylik, 6 ta S bor, ya'ni o'sha riskni kamaytiradigan. Birinchisi o'sha security, ya'ni xavfsizlik, ikkinchi short term, qisqa muddat, uchinchisi o'zini o'zi likvidatsiya qilish, to'rtinchisi selective, ya'ni tanlov bo'lishi mumkin, bemalol tanlash imkoniyatiga ega bo'ladi. Va undan tashqari aktivni hajmi qanaqa, katta yoki kichkina, va har xil spesifik turlarini ishlatishimiz mumkin akkreditivni, va bu akkreditivni albatta eng foydali tomonlardan hisoblanadi. Agar qanaqadir savollaring bo'lsa, bemalol savollarni berish mumkin. Hozir waiting for the questions, Roger.
Yeah, there are no questions on the chat box.
Yeah, so I guess there's no questions.
Okay, well, perhaps you know, these products people are not so familiar, so maybe you don't have a lot of customers asking for these products. But again, it's about education. I think if you make the customers aware that these products exist and how these products can be used, then the customer will show some interest, I'm sure. So I hope you enjoyed today's session, and next week's session is scheduled for the same time. Next week's session is import-export facilities. So it's looking at calculating facilities, different types of facility and calculating facilities, analysing customer trade cycle to make sure that you give the customer the correct facility for his requirements. So if there are no further questions or any questions, we'll sign off and we'll reconvene next week.
Bu albatta hozirgi paytda O'zbekistonda juda ham ko'p ishlatilmayotgan akkreditiv turlar hisoblanishi mumkin, lekin bu albatta asosiysi o'sha bilim olish va albatta bilgan narsalarimizni mijozlarga yetkazib berish, balki qaysidir bir mijozlarga bu akkreditiv turlari foydali yoki qiziqarli bo'lib qolishi mumkin va ishlatishni xohlashlari mumkin. Agar qanaqadir savollar bo'lsa, bemalol savollarni berishlari mumkin. Hozir keyingi seminarimiz bizda albatta keyingi hafta xuddi shu paytda bo'ladi va shu mijozga bo'lgan qulayliklarni hisoblab o'tamiz. Mijozga qanaqangi qulayliklar yaratib berish mumkin o'sha mijoz savdoni amalga oshirayotganda, shularni shu mavzuda gaplashib o'tamiz. Agar savollar bo'lmasa, rahmat hammalariga. Yes, Roger.
Good. Okay. Well, thank you very much, everybody, and see you
Yes,
again next
thank
week.
you.
Have a great weekend.
Yes, thank you so much for the seminar. Have a great weekend. You too.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you.
bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye-bye. Bye.